What we're going to do is we're going to start the room. Now, the room you do not have to use reference images for, right? It's one of the few models you don't have to use references for. So for this one, just kind of make it up out of your head. Now, having said that, much like all the other videos, you really should do it a lot like mine, right? Or use a reference image similar to mine, right? Um, so that's kind of one of those things where, you know, I'm giving you guys some creative freedom, but I don't want to give you so much that you do something so radically harder that it ends up frustrating you and you end up creating tons of problems. But also, I really want you guys to be using certain tools, right? So certain beds, right? You might have kind of got those super modern beds that have no bedposts, no railing. That kind of takes the whole brunt out of all the things I was wanting you to show me you can model on the bed, right? Most of you guys did great with the bed, but just keep that in mind, right? Is that when I start a video up, you see the reference image I'm loading in. You don't have to have exactly that same one, but you should get something quite similar, right? And remember, I did stress that in the videos. Here, I'm going to make a room that's pretty simple. We're not making a whole building. We're not making a whole house, right? We're just kind of doing a simple floor plan for a single room. And we don't want it to be terribly crazy. We want it to have a little bit of angles in it, but nothing too nuts. And this is going to allow me to show you a couple of one tool we've seen before, one new tool that we're going to see a little more on the room, and kind of a tool we've seen before, but we're going to see a new option for it, right? So a lot of stuff we already know, but some new things as well, which is always good. All right, so in this case, we do want to go File, Set Project, because remember, this is the part of Project 2. Remember, Project 2 is the lamp and the room. So we're going to go File, Set Project, and we'll set this to be Project 2. Hit Set. There we go. Now in this case, I don't have any models yet, so I don't have to go to Scenes and Open. I do, however, want to set my units up, right? Because remember, we want this to be to scale. If you forget to set your scale up, which every time we start a new scene, we do that, you're going to have something really, really small, right? By default, this is set to centimeters, and if you're building a couple grid units, your room's going to be super small. So remember, you go to Windows, Settings, Preferences, right? Windows, Settings, Preferences. In there, we have a lot of options, right? A lot of this stuff you can honestly ignore. The defaults are pretty fine. User interface elements, you can kind of turn different things off in here. Display, right? You can kind of turn things off and on if you need to. If you're working on an old computer and sometimes, for whatever reason, your manipulator handles don't work, right? Like if you're working on a really old computer or a computer that doesn't have a terribly good 3D card, you might find that you can't select your manipulators. You might need to change the OpenGL core profile to Legacy. And usually it'll have you restart Maya. If you're on a more recent computer, a newer computer, the OpenGL core should be fine. You can change manipulator size if you want, although plus and minus on your keyboard actually control that too. Even a couple of other things here you might want to explore, right? Settings, though, is the big thing, right? Because we can tell up axis what we want it to be. In this case, our default Y is fine. Linear centimeter is what we wanted to change. We want this to be meters, right? If you guys have noticed in 2020 that the time frame thing isn't here, I think they just got rid of the duplicate, because if you go to actual time slider, you'll find it in here, right? So you can pick your different kind of preset frame rates. So it is somewhere else. I think they just, in 2020, they kind of took it out of here, right? Remember, Files and Projects has your autosave, right? You can enable it to use it so that if you don't save and save often and save multiple versions, remember, saving often is always a good thing. Also, saving multiple versions is good, right? You do not want all your eggs in one basket. And autosave can kind of save your butt. And you notice when you enable it, it automatically sets the autosave destination to your project folder. So if you go to your project folder that you created, you'll see there's a folder called autosaves in it that will have your autosaves in there. And you can tell it how many times, how many number of autosaves to do. You can have it limit that. You can tell it intervals, right? Keep that stuff in mind. Undos are down here, right? And even some selection preferences are here. You can technically tell pre-selection highlighting to be off. If you're masochistic, you can select face with center so that it puts a square in the center and you have to click on that to select the face. There's using a whole face by default on, right? That's an old feature from when Maya was really, really young, and they added this, and that became the default, and I don't know of anybody that's sane that wants to use that one. So usually these things are fine by default on. But remember, there's a lot of preferences in here, right? Color management, if you need to change color management profiles. But for us, settings was the big things. We want to change working units linear from centimeter to meter. But it never hurts to see a couple of these again, just to remind you guys of what's in some of the cooler, bigger things that are in here you might want to do. So I'll hit save. And now each grid unit, instead of being a centimeter in size, is a meter, right? Nothing wrong with centimeters. You'd just be working with a much bigger grid. That would be where you'd maybe go to display grid options box, and you can actually tell there to be a lot more units, right? So remember, you can actually control how many units, the grid units are in here. So if you really want to work with centimeters, just go in here and turn the grid units up way high, right? So just keep that stuff in mind. For us, we're just going to keep it simpler and use meters. Now, in this case, it's quite easy to do this from your top view if you need to, but we can actually do it in perspective as well pretty easily. But remember, if you tap spacebar, right, we can put our cursor over top, hit A. Now, each grid unit's a meter. When you think about a room is easily going to be, you know, probably 10 to 15 by 10 to 15 feet, right? And a meter is 3 feet. So we really want this to easily be, you know, kind of 4 to 6 grid units. Now, we've seen that we can snap to grid units a little bit before, right? We kind of did it on our lamp when we did the centering of the pivot for our spokes. Remember, you have these magnets up here. And we're going to see even more about these magnets later on. Even on our current coming exercise 1, we're going to snap to curve. And then on our desk, we're going to see snap to vertex precision snapping. We'll even see make live later on for when we do a little bit of exploring of retopo. But the very first magnet is snap to grid, right? These magnets right up here. Very first one is snap to grid. And that allows us to snap to these grid units. Now, this is where kind of the big new tool is going to come in. I'm going to tap spacebar to kind of maximize my top view. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the Mesh Tools menu, all right? Because Modeling Toolkit's got a lot of your stuff, but not everything, right? So Mesh Tools has something called Create Polygon. Mesh Tools Create Polygon. And what that allows us to do is how it gives us a little cursor. Basically, this tool works pretty much identical in its mechanics to drawing a curve, right? We've done that a couple times now. Create CV curve, and you just, you left click to make points. However, what this does is it creates a polygon, a big n-gon, right? If we left click drag, you'll see it snaps. So I'm holding down left mouse button and moving it, dragging it. You see how it snaps to a grid unit, right? So I'm going to place a point there. And then I can left click drag over here, and you see how it creates another point. Now in this case, I'm going to left click drag here. And you can always just left click in a place as well. It puts it, right? Left click, it automatically snaps to grid. But if you want to kind of freeform it a little more, pretty easy to just kind of, left click drag. And then we can kind of left click drag here. And you see how it's snapping to the grid units, right? Snapping to the grid units. And then when we're happy, we hit enter. And we made a floor plan. And it's a really nice, precise floor plan, right? So I'm going to leave that, but just show you this really quick again. Snap to grid on. Mesh Tools, Create Polygon. And what you do is you just left click to make a point. Left click to make the point. If you hold down left mouse button and move, it'll drag that point to whatever the closest grid point is, right? And then you let go and you click again, click again, click again. Hit enter. Makes it. So I'm going to turn the snap to grid off because we don't need it anymore. And I'm going to tap spacebar to go out to my 4 views. I'm going to put my cursor back over perspective, tap spacebar there. And you'll now see we have a floor plan. And you'll see it's actually, easily 6 grid units by about 5. So that's going to be a good sized room, right? We don't want our rooms to be terribly small, but we don't want them to be like warehouses either. So, if you're using meters for your grid units, we should be, 4 to 6 for width and height. But we also wanted a little bit of interesting angles here. Don't try to make any little wall separations, right? Where, you kind of have a wall here. If you're going to do that, you want to make sure it's got a nice gap. So don't make any little kind of wall that sticks in there. Don't do that. Keep it really simple like this. But I do want a little bit of an angle in here, so you kind of get to create something slightly more simple than a box, right? Because we want you to use Create Polygon tool for this. But something like this, no kind of walls cutting in here, so like that. Something really simple and profile like this, nothing too complicated. I'm going to left click on that to select it. Now you will notice this is a big n-gon, right? And we don't usually tend to like n-gons. They can do really unpredictable things, particularly when a character changes form, right? Creatures squash, they stretch, they deform, right? Their shapes change. N-gons are not going to be predictable in that situation. Same thing if you're building a car. You've got a lot of curvature on it. You put a giant N-gon on a corner on a car, it's going to create a weird dent. However, this floor is flat, isn't it? And the walls are going to be flat and perpendicular to each other. So this is kind of when you can get away with N-gons, is when you're dealing with really boxy stuff, architectural stuff, right? You can actually get away with N-gons there. So remember, N-gons are usually not a good polygon, but sometimes you can break the rule. So in this case, though, we do need thickness, right? So how do we do thickness? Well, we select the object, hold down right mouse button so we can make sure to be in object mode, right? Green wireframe, should show green wireframe. We'll bring modeling toolkit up, of course, because that's our easy access to a lot of our tools. Remember, extrude is Control E. There's a quick key for it. But I like to make sure you guys know where it's at in the menu. So I'm just going to hit extrude. Remember, extruding in object mode thickens, right? So in this case, because I'm in object selection mode, right? Hold down right mouse button, object mode. This whole object selected. So it knows when I extrude that I want to thicken it instead of do a normal extrusion. So we hit extrude. And once again, usually when we want to thicken, we grab that blue arrow to bring it up. And there we go. And we'll bring this up a couple of grid units because, you know, you're probably got about 10-foot clearance to your ceiling. So probably what would look like about 3 grid units or so will be pretty good for that. There we go. So we've thickened that. And of course we can hit Q to kind of turn off that extrude tool. And now we have this thickened. Now you'll notice that our polygons are black. That's because if we zoom in, we see that our normal direction is facing inward, right? So we know that the normal direction is basically just the direction the face is pointing. But your faces can actually point inward instead of outward, right? So that's what something like your reverse would do, right? I didn't even need it on my cord, but you probably saw it on our revolve. If you get a black wireframe, remember, go mesh display reverse, and that flips your polygons so they face back outward. Now in this case though, I don't actually want that for this room, so I'm going to undo that. But remember, if you want your polygons to face outward, because they're black, mesh display reverse, right? Mesh display reverse, that flips the normals out. In this case though, unlike our lamp and all of our other things we made, you're going to be inside of a room, right? You're going to be inside of it. So we do actually want the normals to face inward because we're going to be inside the room later on when we do our rendering and our texturing. But it is annoying to not be able to see the inside of the room, right? So there is something in Maya, if you go to the shading menu here, right? Everybody see where it's at? It's these little guys right here, shading. And we'll talk about X-ray later on. There's something called backface culling. Backface culling. We check that on. And what it does is it doesn't show the back face, right? And in Maya, your kind of front face, which is aligned to the normal direction, is gray. Your back face is colored black, right? So by going to shading, backface culling, you basically tell it to not show the back face, right? Tell it not to show the back face. Front face, back face, right? So shading, turn backface culling off, or on, right? And that way it'll kind of show you only one side of the object. Makes it a lot easier to work with the room, right? So in this case, now I've got a good start for this. I'm going to go to File, Save Scene As, and it's already going to Scenes. Now in this case, I can just click on the original scene, and I can just kind of edit this instead of having to retype out the whole naming convention. Also, I noticed a couple of Project 1s, you guys did not follow the naming convention. Now, if you guys shorten DA to Intro to 3D 240, that's fine, right? It doesn't have to be 100% identical to mine, but I want it to be fairly close, right? I want it to contain all the important information, spring. You really should follow the naming convention, right? You can't just call it bed, right? Technically that's descriptive, but you're going to get into later classes, project classes, and they're going to have a naming convention, and you are supposed to follow that. So we're trying to develop that habit for you guys already. And I've already talked about this, right? Mentioned it several times when we're saving stuff. Create this naming convention, follow this naming convention. It's in all the earlier videos. Whenever we create new projects or a new scene, you see it here. And it is part of your grade, right? A little part of your grade on your projects. If you go to the rubrics, for the projects in Canvas, you'll see that part of that grade is deleting history, labeling your objects in your outliner, freezing transforms, and following naming convention, right? These are things that we want to get you guys in the habit of doing, right? Because you get to later classes and the teachers are gonna not like you if you don't follow that stuff. It doesn't bother me, it doesn't stress me out, but I just want to develop that habit for you guys for future classes. So we'll call this room, right? So we always do underscore project 2 and then underscore the actual scene, so room instead of lamp. There we go. So remember, follow that naming convention, right? All right. So now we've got the room, and we're not going to finish the room today. We've still got, I want to show you guys how to use booleans and do an arch window and make some trim for the door. We're also going to do our exercise video then. I'm going to do a quick cleanup outliner video. But I do want to make the door today, right? I do want to make the door. So what we're going to do really quickly here is I've got the object selected, right? Hold down right mouse button, object mode. We need a little more geometry through here, right? Now these n-gons generally aren't going to be too much of a problem, right? They can stay n-gons for the most part. Of course, we could always use multi-cut to add in edge loops, right? You'll notice, though, that the edge loops go improper this way, but then we try to put them in there and they stop, right? So if you try to put edge loops in and they don't go all the way around, it's because you created an n-gon, right? And remember, you could kind of, just left-click on something, it creates a point there, and you've all of a sudden made these two things into n-gons, right? So just remember that and keep that in mind. But I do want to go to object mode here, and I want to kind of give myself a bit of geometry everywhere. So I'm going to subdivide this, right? We know smooth will do that. The problem with smooth, though, is it rounds the shape off. So we really don't want to use smooth for this. So how do I subdivide this without rounding the shape off? Well, there is a feature in Modeling Toolkit, and it could be done to polygons, specific polygons, not the whole object, right? Both smooth and add divisions can be done to some polygons, not all of them. In this case, I just want to do it to all. Add divisions, and you'll notice that subdivides without changing the shape, doesn't round the shape off. And you'll see that each quad is subdivided into 4 smaller quads, and even these n-gons are subdivided into quads. Now, if you get weird stuff where like your n-gon kind of ends up having a triangle out here, one of the things you can always do before you do the add divisions, and just to show it, you can go to face selection mode, right? I can left click drag just a small box just to grab just the walls, and you can add divisions just to the walls, right? And of course, you can even just do a small little box select for the ceilings, right? This is just hold down right mouse button, face selection mode. If you do a small little box, only the floor and ceiling are selected. There is a feature in mesh menu called triangulate. It'll take any polygon, quad or n-gon, and turn it all into triangles. So if you're getting some slightly unpredictable results, kind of in the corners here where the big n-gons on the ceiling and floor kind of pop out and do weird stuff there, you can always triangulate the mesh, right? Add divisions will sometimes do it perfectly fine also. In this case, you can even just leave the n-gons, right? Because you notice how the shape looks good, and that shape's not going to change. Rooms don't dance, right? So this is one of those instances where you could leave those n-gons and just add divisions just to the walls, just to give us a little more geometry there. You could add divisions to the whole thing, and if you wanted to, because it maybe sometimes it behaves a little weird in the corners there, you could always even just triangulate those n-gons, right? So kind of just some cool features to see that you have as options. But this is one of those instances where n-gons will be okay because basically they can't get in any trouble, right? They're flat, they're planar, they're connected to other flat and planar objects, there's no curvature, and they don't change their shape. The room stays still, right? So if it looks good now, it's generally going to look good later on. So this is where you can kind of get away with n-gons. But we've seen add divisions would still turn on the quads, and you can even triangulate meshes if you need to later on. So you can still even turn those n-gons into triangles later on if you want to. But for us, leaving those n-gons should be okay. All right. So what I want to do quickly is I want to make the doorway. So I'm going to zoom in here, right? And I'm going to put the door, I think, probably right about here. So I'm going to zoom in pretty far. Hold down right mouse button, right? So you can go to face selection mode. And I'm just going to select those two faces. Be careful it's not selecting any other faces, right? So sometimes you have to zoom in pretty far to just grab those. Remember, F for frame selection would be a great way to zoom in. And what I want to do is I want to make a simple doorway. Now doors tend to be rectangle, pretty much rectangle shapes. So we don't need to do a boolean for that, right? I'm going to show you guys booleans in a later video for this project. But for right now, this is going to be easy enough for us just to extrude this doorway out. So we'll hit extrude, and I'll turn my scale tool on, R for scale, right? R for scale. And I'm just going to grab that center one to scale it in a bit. And I could always kind of scale it in a little bit on the red axis, the x-axis as well. Hit W for move to move it down, right? And we can have that little bit of a lip there. It's okay, because usually doorways have a little bit of a lip. And that will actually work pretty well as a doorway shape, right? So all we had to do is extrude those faces, right? If we wanted to, we'd always move this face up a little bit. Even go to edge selection, move this edge up if we want that just to be a little straighter, right? It's okay. My bad. Select those two faces again, right? We need a little shaping if we want to before this, but that basically gives you a good door shape. And it's just more extrusion, right? But I did use the scale to make it smaller. In this case, I'm going to extrude and hit W to move this back, right? To actually create kind of the door a border as well. Now, in this case, I want to make an actual proper door also, right? And it's going to be easier to do this with this being separated off, right? Now, with just those two faces selected, we can go to the Edit Mesh menu, and we've seen duplicate before, right? We saw it for kind of the brace on our lamp. We saw it on our drawer, right? For our end table. Most of you guys did the drawers, but a couple of you guys forgot to do a proper, actual functioning drawer, that full thickness, right? On your first project. Most of you guys were fine. In this case, though, we don't want to duplicate. I want to cut, right? So duplicate's like copy. It'll take those polygons, copy them into their own object. Edit Mesh Extract, which is right below it, cuts those polygons out, right? It'll actually leave a hole. So if we go to Edit Mesh Extract, and we'll see that extract more later on in later models, just like duplicate, you'll see that it's gone to a green and white wireframe. Remember, that always indicates when you see green and white wireframes that multiple objects are selected. I'm going to hit Q, because Q's our quick key for our selection tool, Q. Make sure I'm in object selection mode. Hold down right mouse button, object, right? And you'll see these are actually separate objects now. In fact, if I hit W for move, you'll notice my move tool is way over here now because center is based on the original room center. So remember, you can always modify center pivot. That only really works and is only necessary for objects because usually it auto centers on a face, edge, or vertex. You'll notice there's actually a proper hole here, right? So whereas Edit Mesh Duplicate would copy and there'd still be those originals there, this didn't. This actually made a separate object. Now in this case, we want this to have thickness. Well, we've seen thickness a couple times before, right? So make sure we're in object mode for object selection. Extrude in object mode, grab that blue arrow to move along normal direction. And now that door is thickened. Remember, Q is a great way to turn off whatever tool you're in and go back to a safe tool, your select tool. So I can go back to object mode here, and we've got a thickened door. Now that is not quite enough for our door, right? Doors often kind of have that little kind of paneling in there. And this is a cool way for me to show you that, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a few edge loops to this doorway. So I'm going to go to multi-cut, and I'm going to, and remember, you can always, if you want to make this a little easier, back to object mode, remember there is the isolate select button, right? That guy right there. It's a toggle, turn it off and on. And whatever's selected, it'll only show that. So I go to multi-cut, hold down control to put an edge loop in here. I'm also going to put one right down the center. Remember, in this case, multi-cut's on. And I've got the snap percentage size set to 50, right? So you can just type in 50. By default, it's set to 10. If you type in 50, when you hold down control, remember, it always puts the edge loop in perpendicular, right? So if you have an edge, we'll put it in perpendicular. So I want to put an edge loop through here. Now control allows to put the edge loop in. Control Shift snaps. So you hold down Control and Shift, right? And then it'll snap right to the middle because the snap percentage size is set to 50. We left click, and now we have an edge loop right down the center. Cool. So I'm going to go to face mode. So I'm going to hold down right mouse button, and I'm going to go to face selection. I'm going to select that face, shift left click, right? Remember, you can drag might be a little overkill because it's easy enough to just manually select those, but you can just left click, shift left click, shift left click, shift left click, right? Just to select those. Remember, shift adds, and just left clicking always interacts, right? Select stuff. In this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to extrude. Now, the biggest problem I have with extrusion right now is that I want to make these 4 separate panels. And to do them one at a time is a bit annoying and slow. So what this allows me to do is show you 2 options in your extrude. So I've extruded, and it brought up this options box. Generally when you extrude, it'll bring up this options box, right? If for whatever reason you're not getting it, you can always go extrude here options box and get it that way, right? But usually it should bring this up. There's 2 things in here we want to see. One is keep faces together, which is on currently, and the other is offset. Now, what does offset do? Well, I'm going to show you that. Now I'm going to go to offset. I'm going to type in a small number like 0.1. And that's actually quite small. It did a little something, but that's a little too small for me. So I'm going to try maybe 0.5. Still really small. Let's try 3. There we go. Now we're starting to see something. I'd even say 5 for that one. It's always good to start a smaller tool and then go, oh, that's not doing enough. What offset does is it's a scale function, right? But unlike your normal scale, it'll make sure that these borders are uniformly even, right? See how they're the same thickness? This face is the same thickness as this one. That's what's cool about offset. Quite useful for doing cool architectural details. So offset really is just scaling this extrusion inward, right? Scaling those faces inward, but it's making sure the thickness around that border of those polygons is the same. That's what offset does. So that's cool. Pretty easy, right? Now, if I click on the word on and keep faces together, it'll turn to off, and you notice how it separates those? So on makes them one giant extrusion. They were selected differently though, right? They were separate selections, so it kind of treats them as a giant polygon and a giant polygon. This just turns them off so that they all extrude individually. So you can see how we're kind of creating that little kind of door framing thing. Or if you ever want to make a Hershey chocolate bar, right? So I'm going to extrude again, push that in a little bit, extrude again, bring that back out again, but bring in some offset. 5 should probably be fine. And so that kind of creates that cool little bit of kind of paneling offset there. And it's neat because we get to see offset, and we get to see that we can turn keep faces together off or on as cool options. That'll probably be a great place to stop there. We'll quickly do the doorknob and kind of the arch and kind of trim for the door on our next lectures. This will probably be a great place to stop for this one though. So we'll kind of turn isolate select off. And now we have a basic room and a basic doorway started. And we learned some cool things about create polygon tool. Got to use snap to grid again. Saw add divisions as a new option, right? And even got to see some cool options in extrude like offset and keep faces together that you can turn off. So that'd be a great place to stop.